Hi guys, so in this video we'll be discussing consumer surplus, its definition and concept, its diagram, and then changes within the diagram itself. So first of all, let's just discuss the definition. Consumer surplus by definition is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. So for this concept, what we can do is, well, take an example, a real life example. Let's say if I go to the shop, this is me, it's pretty cute. And if I go to the shop and if I, let's say, want to buy chocolate, and I'm willing to pay 10 rupees for the chocolate, rupees 10 for the chocolate. But when I go there, I realize or I learn from the shopkeeper, well, that the chocolate is only for 5 rupees. And so even though I was willing to pay 10 rupees, now I actually have to pay only 5 rupees. This leads to, well, excess utility or satisfaction, since now I'm happier. This is my happy face. Wow. So now I'm happier because, well, I was willing to pay more, but now I have to pay less, right? So the difference in this case is 5 rupees. The difference between 10 and 5 is 5 rupees. And so this 5 rupees represents my consumer surplus. It can also be represented on a diagram. Let's have a look at that. So this is a basic demand curve. This is the price axis. This is the quantity axis. This is the demand curve here. Right? Now at this demand curve, let's say this is the price P1, quantity Q1. Let's just elongate this curve, right? So in this curve, well, what I am willing to pay right now for this quantity is this whole area. I'm willing to pay all of this. But the thing is, well, I don't actually have to pay everything. I don't actually have to pay this whole yellow area. In reality, I only have to pay the area which is below the price line. So I only have to pay this area, this yellow shaded area. This is what I have to pay. And so the difference between, well, the initial yellow area and the new yellow area is pretty simple, and it's this area. It's the area above the price line and below the demand curve. The area above the price line, I'm repeating it again. And so it's the area above the price line and below the demand curve. So it's this area, this whole area. It's above the price line. This is the price line at this price point, price line, and this is the demand curve. And this whole blue area, it represents, well, consumer surplus, because it's the area above the price line and below the demand curve. Okay, this diagram is getting a bit messy, so let's move on to the next diagram and then we can show changes over there. So let's discuss how we can show changes of consumer surplus according to changes in price. Right, start. This is again normal curve, normal axis, a normal price axis and a normal quantity axis. Nothing unusual over here. And this is, well, another demand curve. This was our price point, P1 from the previous diagram. And this as well, Q1. Right? Now, let's say the price changes. Let's say for some reason there is a change in price, and so we end up with, well, this price point. Since changes in price always correspond to movements along the demand curve, we are showing a movement along the demand curve like this. And so it leads to an expansion of demand. This is Q2. This is P2. Now, initially we discussed this whole area, this blue area, was our consumer surplus, right? But now, since there has been a change in price, and according to what I was saying, consumer surplus is the area above the price line and below the demand curve. So now the price line is this blue part, right? This is the new price line. And so the area above the price line is everything above the price line, all of this green part. and the area below the demand curve. So this is how we represent well consumer surplus. This is how we understand consumer surplus. It's the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. That's the definition. We have its diagram, and then whenever there is a change in price, it leads to a change in consumer surplus. So these are the basics. Okay, so to reinforce the concept of consumer surplus, we'll just go over one basic MCQ just to get the hang of it. So this MCQ says the diagram shows the market for computers in Pakistan. Okay, and it has a basic demand and supply diagram. The question is which areas represent consumer surplus and consumer expenditure. Okay, so consumer expenditure means what the consumers spend, right? And as we discussed, it's this area. It's all this area. This area is what consumers spend, because the consumers are willing to spend well this whole trapezium sort of thing, this whole thing. But what they do spend is the area below this, right? This area only. Which is why the area or the difference between what they are willing to pay and what they actually have to pay is this part, which represents the consumer surplus. Right? So let's look at the choices. A says consumer surplus is WXY, which, well, it is. It's this triangle WXY, so that's true. It says consumer expenditure is OXY. The consumer expenditure is not OXY, rather it's this whole square, right? It's this whole square. Because the consumers are willing to pay all of the trapezium, but they only actually have to pay, well, the square. And so they end up paying the square only, which leads to consumer surplus. Which is why B is the right answer choice, because it says consumer expenditure is OXYZ, which we have already discussed. And so this area represents consumer expenditure or consumer spending / whatever they actually have to pay. Okay, so just like consumer surplus, there is another concept, producer surplus. It's really important too, producer surplus. So in consumer surplus, we discussed how consumer surplus, well, by definition, was the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. Producer surplus, on the other hand, is for producers. It's the same thing, but only for producers. So it's the difference between what the producers are willing to supply at versus what they actually have to supply at, right? So it's the difference between what they're willing to supply at, what they actually have to supply at. So this also leads to, well, excess utility, which is also known as satisfaction. So the producers are satisfied because now, well, they're earning more money because they were willing to supply at a lower price too, but they end up getting more money. This can also be shown on a diagram. So, well, this is a normal basic demand and supply diagram. This is the demand curve. This is the supply curve. Right? This is the price axis. This is the quantity axis. Okay. Right. So it's the difference between what the producers are willing to supply at and what they actually have to supply at. A very easy way to learn the area or learn how to really identify producer surplus on a diagram is to, well, just take the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So let's look at this point. Over here in this diagram, this point is the equilibrium point, and so this represents, well, the equilibrium price, P1, let's say. And this is Q1, the equilibrium quantity. And since we're looking for producer surplus, as I just said, it's the area below the price line. This is the price line. This is a very easy way to really identify it and to simplify things for yourself. This is the area below the price line, right? This is the price line. So the area below the price line and above the supply curve. This is the supply curve. So the area below the price line and above the supply curve is, well, this triangle. Because this is above the supply curve and it's also below the price line. So this whole area, this green area, represents producer surplus, which, as we discussed, is satisfaction or utility. Utility is a more technical word to use, so it's better to use utility in this case. Utility for the producers, for producers. Just to reinforce this concept, we'll also go over one question. So let's have a look at this question. Question number 2 says the diagram shows the demand curve and supply curve for a product. So it has, well, a basic demand and supply diagram. Which area represents the producer surplus? So in this case, since we have already done this, and so we know, well, producer surplus is always the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So this is the price line. It has been drawn out for us in this case. So this is the price line, and this is the supply curve. So the area below the price line and above the supply curve, well, is this triangle. So instead of going over all the answer choices, let's just look at B, which is the correct answer choice, which says OWYZ. OWYZ is, well, this whole square thing. OWYZ minus OYZ. OYZ is this triangle. If we subtract or if we cancel out this triangle from this square, we end up with this triangle, right? This whole shaded region, which is the consumer surplus, this yellow part, and this is the answer, which is why B is right.